So this is I think it's a double quarter pounder. Double quarter pounder with cheese from McDonald's on Shattuck, one of the least picturesque McDonald's in America. And I worked with some geophysicists and some ecologists and some energy experts to figure out how much oil did it take to make that burger. I'm talking about the fertilizer to grow the corn, to feed the animals, to process them, move them around, make the burger. And it turns out, now these glasses hold 8 ounces, okay? And I will show you how much goes into it. So 16. 24. I should be filling them up to the top, but I don't quite want to. And 2 more. 26 ounces of oil to produce 1 double quarter pound of the cheese. Okay? We're eating a lot of oil. It's chocolate syrup. So what happened when we figured out how to eat oil? Well, we moved from a system that produced 2.3 calories of food energy for every calorie of fuel it put into it, to one that now takes 10 calories of fossil fuel energy to produce 1 calorie of food. If you want a more succinct definition of an unsustainable food supply, it's that. 10 calories in, 1 calorie out. It's very, very wasteful. And a lot of our problems lie in that loss of energy. And you need to remember, food, unlike everything else we make, you can make from the sun. You don't need to use oil to do it. So that's a pretty vivid index to unsustainability. Another problem, unhealthy. It's an unhealthy food chain. When you build a system on monocultures of corn and soy, what do you get? You get a diet built on those crops. They're not edible. The soy we're growing is not edamame, and the corn we're growing is not sweet corn. These are industrial raw materials that need to be transformed to turn into food. They need to be processed. They're the building blocks of fast food. Corn is the animal feed, it's a processed food ingredient, and it's a sweetener. And I brought here, this is a canister of high fructose corn syrup. That is the amount that the average American eats, high fructose corn syrup, in a year. 63 pounds. And I'm afraid to say people your age are probably eating more than that. And the reason why, well, it's a very cheap sweetener because corn is so cheap. Soy is used as an animal feed. It's the protein part of animal feed. It's used as a processed food ingredient, and it's used as oil. Half of the calories when you eat a French fry come from the soy oil in which it likely was fried. 10% of the calories in the American diet now come from soy oil. So we are eating from this corn and soy monoculture. The flood of calories that we're getting off these farms is mostly added or saturated fat from meat and refined carbohydrates, and we love them. Since the time of Earl Butz, the average American is putting away somewhere between 300 and 500 more calories than they used to per person per day. This is since 1980 or so. Most of them in the form of these additional calories in the form of processed corn and soy, with the result that the average American man has gained 17 pounds in that time, and the average American woman has gained 19 pounds in that time. So this is another cost, health. 1 in 3 Americans born in the last decade expected to get type 2 diabetes by current projections. That takes 7 years off their lifespan, costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to treat. 4 of the top 10 causes of death in America now are chronic diseases linked to diet. Heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and stroke. Not all cancers, but some cancers. by promoting and subsidizing and ensuring these crops and this agriculture, we in effect as a society subsidize that burger. We're subsidizing fast food. And in that period, since 1980, the cost of soda, which is a corn product, has gone down 7%, and the cost of fresh produce, which we don't subsidize, has gone up 40%. So these price incentives and disincentives influence people's choices, obviously, especially when you're poor. And we know that obesity and type 2 diabetes are diseases, by and large, of the poor. Economists have tested this idea. There's a great experiment. You should try it sometime. Take $1 into the supermarket and just look for calories. Where can you get the most calories for $1? It's a really interesting exercise. You will find that if you go to the snack food aisles, you can get about 1,200 calories for your $1. But if you go to the produce section, you can only get about 250 in carrots or broccoli or something like that. Same with liquids. You can get 700 calories of soda for your $1 versus 150 calories of orange juice. So we've created a system where the rational thing to do if you're poor and you're trying to stretch your income is to eat really badly. Fourth point about the impact of this flood of corn, cheap meat. It has made meat cheaper than it has ever been and because cattle will tolerate corn. But not very easy. I mean, cattle were designed to, well, evolve to eat grass, right? They're ruminants. They have this amazing thing called a rumen that allows them to do something we can't do, which is turn grass, pure solar energy, into really good meat. But it's too slow. So we give them corn, which makes them sick because they get, I won't go into it. I don't have time to go into it. But it does really bad things to them. So then you have to give them drugs to keep them healthy. You have to give them antibiotics. But it's fast. It's really fast. And efficiency is the driver of this food system. You give them lots of antibiotics to your animals, and you get antibiotic-resistant diseases, which we now have. And these are diseases that have evolved in feedlots and chicken houses and places like that that antibiotics no longer can take care of. And this also leads to food safety problems. These animals, like the ones at the Harris Ranch, live in their own filth, and they live in feedlots that are really I mean, you look out at that farm and you see black as far as you can go. That's not soil. That's not the color of soil in that area. That's manure. And so these are petri dishes for the evolution of new microbes, and we're creating them. So maybe you don't want the burger. Each year, the CDC estimates, Centers for Disease Control, 48 million cases of foodborne illness today, 128,000 hospitalizations, 3,000 deaths. Another problem, pollution. When you move from this ecological way of farming, this closed nutrient loop, to a factory model, you are going to have waste products. Water. Every one of those cows produces on a big feedlot, produces 120 pounds of waste a day. That's full of pharmaceuticals, hormones, as well as nitrogen and phosphorus. This is not stuff farmers usually want. It's just too intensified and has too many other things in it. There's a feedlot in Grandview, Iowa that has, actually I think it's Idaho, I think I made a mistake, with 150,000 head of cattle. And it produces as much waste as the entire city of Chicago. But unlike the city of Chicago, which is required by federal law to treat its waste, feedlots are not. They're in effect exempted from the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. So it just sits around in lagoons, off gases, methane, nitrous oxide to the atmosphere, leaks every now and then, and stinks. Downstream of these places, frogs get sex change operations they didn't sign up for because of the hormones in the water. Now, let me remind you that in our pre-World War II system, sun-based farm system, there was no such thing as pollution, since animal waste was precious. It was a source of fertility. And Wendell Berry has the best quote on this, and he says he thought this was a great example of agricultural improvement, which he put scare quotes around, when we took animals off of farms and put them on feedlots. He said, we took a solution where the crops feed the animals and the animals feed the crops. And we neatly divided it into two problems. A fertility crisis on the farm, which we remedy with chemical fertilizer, and a pollution crisis on the feedlot, which we don't remedy at all. So if you look at things ecologically, this was an absolutely insane thing to do. And as I said, our laws governing clean water and clean air treat these giant feedlots as farms, and they're usually exempted. And in fact, now the Republicans just got something attached to a funding bill in Congress that makes it illegal for the USDA to even keep track of where the feedlots are and how many animals they each have, making it impossible to regulate them, which was exactly their idea. Air pollution, last point. The stench of these places is not just an aesthetic problem. It leads to immediate health problems. When I've been on feedlots for Omnivore's Dilemma, dry feedlots, there is this dust in the air, and someone explained to me it's fecal dust, something I hadn't encountered before. It's pretty nasty, and there's high rates of asthma downwind of these places. But these places contribute huge amounts of greenhouse gases, particularly methane and nitrous oxide, which, as I said, by an order of magnitude, trap more heat than CO2. And the UN estimates that worldwide, something like 18% of greenhouse gases can be traced to animal agriculture. Meat eating is one of your, if you do it, is one of your most significant contributors to climate change. And changing the kind of diet you have would do a lot more than changing the kind of car you drive to reduce your impact on climate change. And beef is worst of all. The Supreme Court has ruled that the EPA has authority to regulate greenhouse gases, which was a really important decision a couple years ago, and the EPA is exercising this in the case of power plants. So how about doing it in meat plants and on feedlots? Well, that's a question for the administration, which has exempted agriculture from its new regulations of both carbon and methane. And that's another key point to remember in this course. Big Ag is enormously powerful in Washington. It is one of the most powerful lobbies we have. So just to wrap up, and I'd love to take some of your questions. You're going to be taking a closer look at many of these questions. I've really just kind of gone over them lightly, and others I haven't mentioned. My focus here, the big lens I want you to see the system through, is that of ecology. For so many of the problems of industrial agriculture stem from a change in its ecological foundation. The move from a system based on the energy of the sun to one based on the energy of fossil fuels. From the logic of an ecosystem to the logic of a factory. I've left a lot out. The impact of this change on social inequality and labor, I've only hinted at. On the welfare of farmers living in other countries, that our flood of cheap corn makes very hard for them to compete. We're changing their lives too with this system. But it's coming. We'll get to that. Raj Patel will talk about that. But what's really exciting and hopeful is that after decades of being under the radar, all these problems, public health, energy, climate change, pollution, have become inescapable and are now very much on everyone's radar. And they are driving this food movement that we're going to be discussing over the course of this semester, this food movement that is now rising across the country. And also driving the rise of new technologies like genetic modification, which is a response to these problems also. Whether it's good or bad, it is a response. So one of the critical questions now before us is there a way to return our food system to a basis of solar energy? And I don't want you to come away thinking that the solution means turning back the clock, because it's not. The challenge is to find new ways to harness solar energy in agriculture. And there are farmers, and you will hear about them in this semester, who have figured out how to do this. And some very exciting farms that have restored the relationship between plants and animals and figured out the power of diversity to deal with pests. And you'll meet some of these farmers this semester. That we can, I think, return our food system to a reliance on photosynthesis. Should be simple enough. And some of our guests will bring that remarkable news to you. So I'm going to leave it right there, and thank you very much for your attention, and take your questions. So thanks a lot.